If we take a look at the map of Spain, we'll find there are two biggest cities by population: Madrid, the capital, and then Barcelona, the tourist capital. And if you want to get from one to the other, you have a few different choices. You can either drive for about 6 hours, you can also take an hour-and-a-half flight, or you can hop on a high-speed train that will cover this distance of more than 600 kilometers in about 3 hours. The train is called AVE, and that line has been in operation for almost 20 years. Now, if we take a look at the map of Canada, our two biggest cities are Toronto and Montreal. They are a little bit closer to each other at 540 kilometers, and if you want to get from one to the other, you also have a few different options. You can either drive for about 5.5 hours, you can also take an hour-and-a-half flight, or you can also take a train with Via Rail. But to cover this shorter distance than the one in Spain, it will take you more than 5 hours by train, plus you will encounter constant delays. In fact, did you know that Canada is the only G7 country that does not have any high-speed rail system? But the question is, why? Well, to answer this question of why passenger trains in Canada are just so bad, I'm inviting you on this 4-station journey. And the first station we're going to visit today is going to be called TurboTrain Station. Imagine it's the mid-1960s in Canada. Canadian National Railway, or CN for short, is running both freight and passenger trains. But passenger ridership is in total freefall from its World War II peak, because people now buy personal cars and use highways to get to places, as well as the jet age is really starting to take off. Canada has essentially declared passenger rail a dying business, even subsidizing 80% of its losses, just letting it die quietly. But there's one glimmer of hope: the Toronto to Montreal corridor. Maybe if trains were faster, they could still be a viable way for people to travel. And a great example, though completely out of reach for Canada, materialized in 1964 over in Japan. Over there, they launched Shinkansen, also known as the bullet train, that traveled at speeds of up to 210 kilometers an hour at launch. And Japan really sparked this global high-speed rail craze, because just a year later, the US passed their High-Speed Ground Transportation Act, which aimed at developing high-speed rail systems. And then the French started working on what's going to be called the TGV, a highly successful engineering project. So Canada simply didn't want to get stuck behind. And in 1966, CN leased 5 futuristic-looking turbo trains from United Aircraft Corporation in Connecticut. Now, the trains were not electric though. Instead, they were powered by gas turbines and built from aluminum, two technologies borrowed straight from the aviation industry. And CN's goal was to make their existing Rapido Express service from Toronto to Montreal that took 4 hours and 59 minutes be at least an hour shorter. So with that in mind, it all sounds pretty cool, right? But I think at that point in time, Canada makes one of the biggest mistakes that ends up haunting the country up to this very day. The thing is, CN is a freight company first, but to move all of that freight, you need tracks. And CN got most of its tracks from the Grand Trunk Railway, which built huge chunks of Canada's original network back in the 1850s. Now, that company went pretty much insolvent after laying those tracks, so it got absorbed into CN in the 1920s. But the point is that those tracks were designed for one job: to move very slow and very heavy trains. So when CN's excited marketing team pitched the turbo train as the vehicle to propel Canada into the new age, they had to settle for the fact that these trains will still travel on the very same outdated tracks. Building a dedicated passenger line wasn't even discussed because, remember, passenger rail has just been declared a dying business. So with the tracks now sorted, kind of, the turbo train is ready for its demonstration run just 2 years later. It's December 10th, 1968, and CN stages the ultimate publicity stunt by loading a turbo train with 300 journalists on their way from Toronto to Montreal. And at a railway crossing in Kingston, which is about 2 hours east of Toronto, a meat truck drives straight into the train's path. It slices it clean in half, and of course, people on board take a bunch of pictures. But nobody's injured, and the train stays on the rails, which ironically proved the point that a lightweight aluminum train can still take a massive hit without derailing, so the subsequent launch into revenue-generating service went ahead as planned. But then true Canadian winter arrived, and the turbo's brakes froze solid, its suspension started to break, and overall it had quite a few reliability issues. It took another 5 years of substantial rebuilding for the turbo to settle into smooth and reliable service. And amazingly, in 1976, so full 50 years ago, the turbo set a rail speed record in Canada that is still held to this day, because it reached 226 kilometers an hour. But by the time the turbo works reliably, the world around it has changed. In 1973, the oil crisis hits and fuel prices just go through the roof. So all of a sudden, the train that is powered by thirsty jet-style turbines, it doesn't look so appealing anymore. In France, they actually faced the exact same problem, because early TGVs were powered by gas turbines as well. But they pivoted by going fully electric, and Canada did not. So what did Canada do? Well, they decided to look south for inspiration. In 1971, the Americans bundled all of their money-losing passenger trains into one national company, Amtrak. So 6 years later, Canada decides to copy their homework, which means that it's now time to travel to our next station, because in 1977, Via Rail is born. And on paper, it sounds like exactly what Canada needs: one dedicated company with one job, passenger rail. But Via inherits a bunch of old trains, some dating back to the 1940s and 50s, plus the fuel-hungry turbos, so not such a great start. And when both Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, the two competing freight companies, fully exit from passenger rail business, they of course decide to hand over everything that loses money, but keep the one thing that's worth a fortune: the tracks themselves, every single kilometer of them. Which means that from day one, Via is essentially a tenant, running their trains on somebody else's railroad, plus they need to pay rent for that privilege. Now, how much rent exactly? Well, it turns out the contract is confidential, but I was able to find this quote from the Standing Committee on Transport, which reveals that back in 1998, Via was paying about $50 million a year to use CN's and CP's tracks. It might sound like a lot, but considering the fact that CN's and CP's yearly revenues are in billions of dollars, Via's rent is essentially just a rounding error to them and not really necessary for their business growth. But even after Via has already paid for their rent, they still have zero say over the tracks they need to run on. It's always the freight companies that decide which train goes where, and remember, cargo is their bread and butter. So when CN or CP need to use the line, guess who is going to wait? And there's one more problem. Via was not created by an act of parliament. Instead, it was created by an order in council, which basically means that they are just an additional line item in a federal budget. And that might sound kind of irrelevant, but it shapes everything about how this company runs, because with no law behind it, Via has no guaranteed funding, and they cannot raise any money on the open market like other crown corporations, like CN could always do. So Via's entire network kind of exists at the pleasure of whoever sits in office that year, so they must answer to their political masters first and to their passengers second. So things are looking pretty bleak, right? And at this point you might ask a question: is there any demand from Canadians for rail travel at all? But the thing is, even back in the 80s and 90s, even with a crappy product, millions of people still chose Via Rail to travel with. You gotta remember that Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal area is one of the busiest corridors on the entire continent, and there's also Highway 401, which is by now considered to be one of the busiest in the entire world. So the question was never really about demand, it was always about which vehicle. So in early 80s, Via decided to try to be a bit more competitive, and they ordered brand new trains from Bombardier, a Canadian company now, which they called LRC, Light, Rapid, Comfortable. But do you see a pattern? Canada is changing their train yet again, but they don't do anything about the tracks themselves. And of course, the LRC doesn't solve any of their problems at all. So the company kind of tries to limp along, but the thing is, in 1989, the Mulroney government slashes a full $1 billion from their budget, which means that then VIA had to cut their network almost in half. So in cities like Regina or Calgary or Thunder Bay, people kind of wake up with no passenger train service at all. And then in 1995, something really peculiar happens. I'm not sure if you knew it, but CN was government-owned. But by mid-90s, Canada was running a huge budget deficit, almost $40 billion. So they decided to sell CN, all of it. They sold it for $2.2 billion, which means that from 1995, CN answers to its shareholders only. And they love freight because it brings in lots of cash. So by the late 90s, VIA is essentially trapped. They have a shrinking network, old trains, and a yearly rent that must still be paid in full. There's only one way out of this trap: dedicated passenger tracks. Which brings us to the next station. It's called High-Speed Rail Station, or it's also known in Canada as the study of high-speed rail. Did you know that since 1970, Canada produced more than 20 different studies on high-speed rail, but none of them went anywhere? There was this one from 1984 called High-Speed Passenger Rail in Canada. Nothing happened. Then there was this joint study between Canada, Quebec, and Ontario, done in 1995. They concluded that high-speed rail was feasible, but then they just recommended to not build it. Then Via Fast from 2002, Eco Train from 2011, and the thing is, there is a study on a study on a study with no end result in sight. Until something completely different happens. In 2021, Ottawa launches, for the first time ever, not a study, but a procurement with real money and with real companies, and it's called High Frequency Rail from Toronto to Quebec City. Now, it's not high speed exactly, because there will be relatively conventional trains traveling at speeds of up to 200 kilometers an hour, and the cost will be roughly $6 to $12 billion. But at its core sits the idea that Canada has been dodging since 1966. So this time, the trains will run on their own dedicated passenger tracks.
Our HFR proposal includes dedicated passenger tracks, new trains, 3 times as many departures, and regional hubs designed to optimize services for communities. So, what would all that mean for you? Frequent passenger trains, shorter travel times, and improved schedules to fit your life.
And then, surprisingly for Canada, this ambition starts to grow because somewhere, somebody, asks a very obvious question. If we're going to build dedicated tracks, why are we going to build slow ones with slow-moving trains? So in October of 2024, the government confirms that this project is going to be upgraded to a full high-speed rail system with trains traveling at speeds of up to 300 kilometers an hour. And then on February 19th, 2025, Justin Trudeau makes an announcement that the project gets a name, Alto, which, coincidentally, is the name of our final station today. It's Alto Station. So what exactly is Alto? Well, it's roughly 1,000 kilometers of brand new, all-electric, dedicated passenger tracks with 7 stations, all the way from Toronto to Quebec City. And trains will be able to get up to speeds of 300 kilometers an hour, and just to put it into perspective, you'll be able to get from Toronto to Montreal by train now in less than 3 hours. And for the first time in this entire story, the tracks should belong to the passenger railway. There will be no landlord, no rent, and as far as I know, there will be no railway crossings. Now the question is, who is building it? Well, Canada went with a structure called a public-private partnership, a P3. So over here we have Alto, a brand new crown corporation that essentially represents the interests of both you and me, the taxpayers. And then here we have Cadence, a consortium that essentially is going to build things. Now, Cadence consists of 6 companies. We have CDPQ Infra, an infrastructure company out from Quebec Then we have another Canadian company, AtkinsRéalis, also known as SNC-Lavalin, and they were involved in the whole Libya and Justin Trudeau scandal, so I'll let you Google that one yourself. Then we have a couple of French companies, SYSTRA and Keolis. They kind of build railway systems all over the world. And also we have SNCF Voyageur, another French company, who essentially run the TGV. And they were the same people who dumped gas turbines back in the 70s, and they went fully electric when Canada did not. So 50 years later, Canada simply decided to hire those people. And also we have Air Canada. I'm not sure what Air Canada is doing here. Maybe they will somehow try to integrate their flight network into Alto's network, so we'll see. But if this structure kind of reminds you of something, it should, because P3 is essentially the same structure that was used to build Eglinton LRT, a 19-kilometer transit line in the middle of Toronto, which cost $13 billion. It finally opened in February of 2026, a mere 15 years after the construction started. I made a whole video about that one as well, so feel free to check it out if you want. But now, let's talk about a few numbers. And the first one is the price, because current estimates show that Alto is going to cost anywhere from $60 to $90 billion. Or in other words, to build one single kilometer of track, it's going to cost anywhere from $60 to $90 million. So quite pricey. But now let's talk about the calendar, because if everything goes perfectly, and you've just sat through this entire video, so you know exactly how often that happens, wink wink, then construction is going to start around year 2029. So the first stretch of the line is going to open from Ottawa to Montreal around year 2037. And the full line's completion is estimated to happen anywhere in the mid-2040s. But the thing is, even without any shovels in the ground, Alto is already getting pushback, because farmers are fighting for their land already, and critics are calling this project a $90 billion boondoggle.
Potentially, even farmers like these here will lose large parts of their lands and have their way of life completely destroyed. That is why I am announcing today that Conservatives oppose the $90 billion Liberal Alto Train, that we call on the Carney Liberals to cancel it, and I am confirming that a future Conservative government will cancel this $90 billion boondoggle altogether.
So to wrap this up, this was probably one of the most exciting, but at the same time one of the saddest topics that I've ever researched. VIA is also kind of getting sidelined with Alto because originally it was their own child. It was even called VIA HFR, subsidiary of VIA, until that subsidiary got its own CEO, who paid over $300,000 to a marketing firm called Cassette, who essentially said to just drop the name VIA from it and rename it to Alto, which they ultimately did. And then in 2022, VIA introduced brand new Siemens trains to their tracks, and CN was not too happy with how fast they were going, so they just ordered VIA to slow down significantly. And VIA had no choice but to oblige, but they kind of got fed up and took CN to court, and they're still fighting. But while all of this is kind of stuck in the middle of courts and debates and legal battles, it's regular Canadians who are still paying the price. And the best way to get from Toronto to Montreal is still by plane, the fastest way, right? But our plane tickets are also not the cheapest either. In fact, I did a whole video about that one as well, so feel free to watch it again if you want. But for now, I just wanted to say thank you so much for traveling all 4 stations with me and getting to the end of the line. And before I go, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you think Alto makes sense? So leave your comment below. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.